Hey all. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the relationship between emotions and epistemology, or knowledge formation, how it is that we come to have knowledge about the world, or knowledge at all. So we saw in the last video the dumb view, right? The dumb view is the claim that emotions are like irrational or irrational disruptions to other mental processes, right? Like cognitive processes. So a corollary to this dumb view, to the dumb view, is the myth of dispassionate investigation, which is a piece, sort of one aspect of positivist epistemology. So the claim here is that emotion is not allowed to play a role in the justification of claims, or how Jaggar describes it is as the logic of justification. So the idea here is that when scientists have on their scientist hats, what they do is that they leave all of their emotion at the door of the lab. And that when they come in and when they're doing science, they're being objective, right? The goal of Western science on this view is to filter out subjective values, emotions, and biases. That's what it means on this view to be objective. Now, I think in a lot of ways this seems somewhat intuitive to us, right? We describe science as being objective, as being observer independent. But Jaggar wants us to note a couple of problems. First, values are part and parcel of how we attend to the world, right? So to get to this point, note that Jaggar introduces not just the logic of justification, which is how we justify and defend certain claims, but also the logic of discovery. So what is the logic of discovery? Well, the logic of discovery is how we come to identify certain things as being worthy of investigation in the first place, right? So a great example is this. James Clerk Maxwell very famously showed that electricity and magnetism were like just sort of two manifestations of the same thing. Physicists, please provide me with details. I depend on you to help me out here. So James Clerk Maxwell, in identifying the equations showing that magnetic forces and electrical forces are translatable one into the other, found that electricity could be described in terms of magnetism. Clerk Maxwell said, if I were the creator, I wouldn't want it to be this one-way direction. I think it would be much more elegant, much prettier, in a sense, if these were symmetrical laws. So that not only can electricity be described in terms of magnetism, but magnetism can be described in terms of electricity. And so later research bore this out, right? Found out that electricity and magnetism were sort of describable using interchanging equations. What does that mean for us? Well, what it means is that Clerk Maxwell used emotions in the logic of discovery, right? He used emotions to come up with his hypotheses about the relationship between electricity and magnetism, right? He thought about elegance and what would be prettier, right? What would make for a more beautiful universe, right? These are all values and emotions. And so they played a part in the logic of discovery. However, the myth of dispassionate investigation would say, those emotions should not play a role in the logic of justification. They can help us find and meet things to talk about, but they don't play a role in supporting those claims. However, where this claim breaks down is that what counts as something worth investigating and what counts as acceptable evidence, or what counts as evidence, these things are laden with values. So we know that not everything can count as evidence for a claim, but only certain things count as evidence for a claim. So the question is how do we do this in the first place? How do we know what counts as evidence in favor of a claim? Well, I think the missing piece here is that there's a component of emotions and value involved. So on top of that, what is worthy of being discovered or what is worthy of being thought about and investigated, this is also bound up with notions of value. And value, as we've seen, are bound up with emotions. So not only answering what counts as evidence for a claim, but also what's worthy of being investigated in the first place. These things are bound up with value and bound up with emotion. So, whenever we're thinking about justification, emotion is doing work in the background. So that's one problem with the myth of dispassionate investigation. The second issue with the myth of dispassionate investigation is that we see how values in the past are reflected in scientific theories and discoveries. So in other words, when we look back in the past, we see our values manifested in science. If you want an example of this, consider that homosexuality was classified as a mental illness by the American Psychiatric Association, which was at the time, and I think still is, the world's largest association of psychiatrists. Homosexuality was classified as a mental illness until 1973. So, if you wanted evidence of somebody as having mental illness, you would point to their homosexual behavior. So, if you were to ask a psychiatrist in 1950, if you were to ask them, why, Joe Smith is depressed or anxious or, has other kinds of mental concern, has sort of mental health issues, that psychiatrist might say, well, is he a homosexual? Homosexual is a kind of mental illness which can cause these other problems. So we had scientific theories and treatments and remedies and ideas grounded in thinking of homosexuality as a kind of mental illness. But we now know that that's absolutely absurd, right? We know that homosexuality is not a mental illness. But the important thing to remember is that our not too distant ancestors thought of it as a mental illness. So we see then the shift in values, and we see correspondingly a shift in the science. So our values are reflected in science. And it's hard to see that now, right? It's hard to see that in the present day when we're looking around us. But when we look back to the history of science, we see that. So we have then these two concerns about the myth of dispassionate investigation. The first one, that values are part and parcel of how we do science. And second, that we can see our values reflected in the science of the past. Right? These give us good reason to think that the myth of dispassionate investigation, that science is about being objective in the sense that we filter out the subjective values and emotions and biases, right? That really is a myth, that science doesn't actually work that way. And science, being our paradigm of knowledge acquisition and formation, the idea propagates to all of our other ways of thinking about knowledge. So what now? Well, the first thing to note is that undermining the myth of dispassionate investigation doesn't mean that we don't need evidence that's available to others. We do need that, right? It's not right. We can't. It's not as though we can simply dispense with objective, verifiable information that can be sort of perceived and taken account of by others, right? We still need that. It's just that we're now sort of compelled to recognize that emotions play a key part of this process, right? Emotions play a part in the selection and evaluation of evidence.